So this activity or note is a kind of blend between a lesson on the scientific process, but also setting us up to do a lab experiment. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through this and we're going to talk about setting up our first lab activity of the semester, which is the paper towel lab. Okay. And so you know that this is in your textbook, and so you can look up these pages if you want. I'm going to take you through most of these to try and kind of guide us through the introduction to our lab. If you're watching this because you weren't in class, you can kind of follow the steps. You can try the experiment for yourself, or you can use the sample data that is that's provided, and you can kind of look through that. Okay, so the first step in the scientific process in kind of any investigation is what we call the purpose. Okay, this is also sometimes called a question. And the example that we're going to do, because our first lab is commonly known as the paper towel lab, we're going to ask a question: which brand of paper towel kind of is the best? But when we analyze that question, when we analyze that purpose, that's very vague because the word best could mean many, many things. So let's cross out that line and let's say something more specific. There's lots of things about paper towel that we could test. What we're going to do is we're going to say which brand of paper towel is the most absorbent. And of course, absorbent means how much water will it soak up. And of course, this is one of the things that we see in commercials, right? We see that this brand of paper towel is more absorbent than any others. So we're going to test that. The second part of the scientific process is a hypothesis. This is an educated guess or a prediction of the answer. And we're going to use an if-then statement to form our hypothesis. It's a really simple construction, and it helps us to make a sentence that will really, really be helpful so that we can compare very accurately. So if Bounty brand paper towels are compared to our school paper towels, which is kind of a no-name brand, then, so here's the if Bounty paper towels are compared to school paper towels, and now here's the then, what do we think? Well, if we believe the commercials, then we're going to say, then Bounty will absorb more water because it will be the more absorbent. Okay, this doesn't have to just be with Bounty and school paper towels. It could be two different brands. You could say Bounty and No Name, or you could say Bounty and Scott paper towels, or whatever you have on hand. The next step in the scientific process is the procedure. Okay, sometimes this is called the method, and it's used to describe how the experiment is done. Okay, we're going to use numbered steps. Each is on a new line. And so we're going to begin with step number 1. So for step number 1, what we want to do is that I'll just tell you the procedure for this. And I'm sure that most of this will when you see the steps, it will be quite obvious, like, oh yeah, okay, this all makes sense. So the first step is that we want to cut a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter square of each brand of paper towel. Okay, so we're going to do this for the Bounty, and we're going to do this for the school paper towel. The second step is to use a graduated cylinder to measure 25 milliliters of water and pour it into a beaker. So we're using a graduated cylinder because it's more accurate. And then we're measuring 25 milliliters and we're pouring it into a beaker. Third step is to submerge the piece of Bounty into the beaker of water and allow it to sit for 30 seconds. So we're going to put all of the Bounty underwater. We're going to let it sit for 30 seconds. Step number 4, remove the Bounty from the beaker and allow it to finish dripping. Okay, so we don't want to, if it's dripping wet, we don't want to lose any of that water. We want it to finish dripping so that we can say that the water has truly been absorbed. Number 5, pour the remaining water back into the empty graduated cylinder and measure the volume. And last but not least, repeat steps 2 to 5, now using the school paper towel. So this is our procedure, and there's some things in here that are very specific, and we want to talk about kind of why we've done these things and how we've set up this experiment. So let's talk for a minute about variable types. Okay, let's talk for a minute about variable types. And what I would have you do now, if you were in class, is I would have you reread page 8 and then try and complete this chart. Okay, so what I would say, if you're watching this at home, if you haven't seen this, I would say pause this, go and reread page 8 and really look at the different types of variables and the definitions of those variables. And let's try and match up our experiment as an example with what these different variables are. Okay, so if you're at home and you're watching this, press pause and reread this part of our textbook. Okay, so the independent variable, the definition of this is the variable that is changed by the experimenter. Okay, so it's what we're changing between our different trials. And so in the paper towel experiment, what we're changing between the two trials is, of course, the brand of paper towel. So this is our independent variable. This is what we're testing. The dependent variable is the value that depends on our results from which independent variable is chosen. This typically is what is measured by the experimenter. So when we think back to our procedure and we think back to what we're actually measuring, is that we're measuring the amount or the volume of water that's absorbed by paper towel, right? So that's our dependent variable. That's what we're measuring. And we're measuring this indirectly using a graduated cylinder. So we know how much water we started with. And of course, we know how much water we are ending with. Then that means it's going to tell us how much water was absorbed. So this is basically the formula that we're going to use. The amount of water that's absorbed is equal to the amount of water that we started with minus the amount of water that was left over. And that'll tell us how much the paper towel absorbed. The last kind of variable are the ones that usually students get pretty easily, and these are the controlled variables. This is a variable that stays the same throughout the experiment. And the reason why we keep these variables the same is because they keep the experiment fair so that it's unbiased. And typically in any experiment, the more variables that we control, the better the experimental design, and therefore the conclusions that we make have a greater chance of being true. And the scientific term for the word true is valid. So if we can control more and more variables, then our conclusions can be said to be more valid. So think about, in this experiment, when we read through here, what is the same for each of these types of paper towel? There's a couple things that stand out right away. The first is the size of the paper towel. We cut a 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter square of each brand. Of course, this test would not be fair if we were allowed to use 20 centimeters by 20 centimeters of Bounty and only 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters of the school paper towel. That just wouldn't be a fair trial. Another thing that we kept the same was that we used the same amount of water initially in the beaker, right? So that we used 25 milliliters of water for both. The other thing that we did that was the same was that we allowed the time in the water to be the same, right? 30 seconds. We didn't let the one kind of sit in the paper towel for a long time. We kind of, took it out. So what we're going to do is that at this point, I'm going to say, this is where, as a class, we would say, okay, now let's use our procedure and let's collect our observations. And so we're going to go through this. Obviously, if you're watching this at home, you won't have access to this, but there is some sample data that I'm going to provide. And you can look at all this information. You can kind of draw some conclusions, which is the last part in any kind of experiment. And so here, to finish this off for the conclusions, these determine if the hypothesis was correct or valid by looking at supporting information from the data that we recorded. Okay, so we're going to look at the observations, this recorded data, and we're going to look for supporting information. The best, the strongest, the most meaningful, the most valid conclusions are made if the experiment was repeated at least 3 times, and the observations made were consistent, and if we had a large number of control variables that were kept steady. Students are typically guided through conclusions by answering a series of questions, and of course that's what you'll notice for this lab are down here. So after you take care of kind of the sample data for the class observations, you can answer these questions.